Welcome to Drisha. This class is the second session of Revelations from the Whirlwind with Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Dr. Sinensky.
Okay, so hopefully there's a source sheet there. But before we dive into the sources, just to frame for a few minutes, just to kind of situate ourselves, not only in terms of this series, but in terms of the context of the historical moment in which Yechezkel is prophesying. So essentially, we last time we discussed the question of se'ara, the meaning of a whirlwind and its symbolism as an indicator of revelation. And we saw with regard to Eliyahu Navi that it really indicated not only the intensity of the presence of God, not only the intensity of the presence of Eliyahu as a zealot for God, as you said last time, as well, but in addition to that, the notion that God was setting up a contrast, that the Se'ara was almost a way of taking Eliyahu out of this world because he could no longer operate or function successfully as a leader for the Jewish people in this particular moment, given their idolatrous cravings and the particular needs of the nation at that time. And instead, the handoff to Elisha, who, as opposed to being a zealot purely for God, now represents God through a softer touch, through Yeshua, through performing acts of salvation on behalf of the people. And so that's essentially really what we find. Now, the theme of Se'ara, of course, continues elsewhere in Tanakh, and today we're going to examine the second instance of this, specifically with regard to the prophecies of Yechezkel. Now, Yechezkel is famed for, among other things, his Ma'aseh Merkavah, the incredibly obscure and abstruse prophecy which in some ways echoes, but in other ways actually sharply departs from the prophecy of Yeshayahu Hanavi in Perek Vav of his book. Yechezkel's parallel prophecy is in Perek Aleph of his. It's famously read on the morning of the first day of Shavuot. So for those who stay up all night, they won't understand it regardless. Most of us normal plebeians, so it's kind of a good throwaway, maybe getting your last nap, at least speaking for myself, before davening Musaf and hopefully being able to stay awake through the remainder of Tefillah, but of course, it is at the same time one of the most important. The Gemara in Masechet Sukkah goes so far as to say that davar katan, that a small matter, this refers to Havayot Abaye v'Rava, the classical exchanges that we find in the Gemara, whereas a davar gadol, that's Maaseh Merkavah and creation as well. So obviously, Maaseh Merkavah contains within it multitudes, to loosely apply Whitman's classic saying, and it really essentially is one of the more difficult, of course, most difficult prophecies in the entirety of Tanakh. And yet, without claiming to be able to understand or to delve to the depths of this particular prophecy, at the same time, I think it's worth taking a moment to see what we perhaps can glean from this metaphor of the Se'ara in this context, and to better understand perhaps not only this particular immediate prophecy in the narrower sense, what it tells us about the book of Yechezkel as a whole, and even more broadly than that, what it perhaps indicates about the symbolism of subsequent divine revelations after the events of Matan Torah, which is, of course, upcoming. So with that, let's situate the prophecies of Yechezkel. So the very beginning of Sefer Yechezkel tells us that he is prophesying during the reign of Yechoniah, during the reign of Yechoniah, one of the final kings of Malchut Yehuda. So let's just take a moment to provide that historical perspective. Where are we exactly in the stories of Melachim in that context, if, as it were, at what point in moment in history is Yechezkel prophesying? So Yechezkel, excuse me, Yechezkel is situated between the Nivot of Yeshayahu, certainly the first part of Yeshayahu, which long precedes the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and on the other hand, those of Yirmiyahu, who actually experiences and not both predicts, but also describes and depicts the tragedies of the Churban. And Yechezkel, it's fair to say, is situated in between, on the precipice of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, just a few years beforehand. Specifically, the reign of Yechoniah is taking place approximately some between 11 and 13 years before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. let's say that the Nevuot of Yechezkel are taking place or beginning in approximately the year 597 BCE, with, according to historians, the destruction of the first temple taking place 11 years later, again, approximate, but let's say 586 before the Common Era. So let's say 11 years, again, maybe a little bit more, but that's roughly around where we are talking. We recall that long before this, there was a division between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom is long gone, destroyed almost 100 years prior due to their perversity, their dedication to idolatry, which was even more severe than that of Malchut Yehuda. Malchut Yisrael, long gone, destroyed by Assyria at the zenith of its power, dispersed to Ashur, to Nineveh, and other locations in Assyria. And as we say, the lost 10 tribes really lost to history, and that it really is ancient history by the time we come to Yechezkel. What Yechezkel is observing is that unfortunately, so many of the difficulties and the spiritual shortcomings that ultimately overcame and led to the destruction of the northern kingdom have continued to and even more severely afflicted the south as well. Whereas the earlier kings of Yehuda tended to be more righteous, and there certainly are some exceptions, most famously perhaps the example of Yoshiyahu, Chizkiyahu as well, but on the whole, we see a decline in the spiritual commitments of the southern kingdom, such that God ultimately determines to destroy the Beit Hamikdash as well. Yechonia takes the stage at, according to the straight reading of the Psukim, at just a tender age of 8 years old. Some claim that it's actually 18. It's kind of improbable. Some say yes, he was 8, but there were others who were the de facto kings. Whatever exactly the story was, clearly he was someone who, and we know that he only ruled for a couple of years. And during his time, Yechezkel Hanavi prophesies. Not only that, but during that period, we actually have the first of two moments or stages of exile for the southern kingdom. If the north was destroyed in one fell swoop, one great diaspora, many decades prior to these events, here we have two subsequent or two stages in the dispersion, in the exile of the Jews to Babylonia. The wealthier, more prominent leaders of the community are exiled along with Yechanyahu some roughly 18 years prior to the actual destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He continues to rule from exile for a brief period of time. He is replaced ultimately by Tzidkiyahu, who is essentially a vassal king, who then also they all get exiled to Bavel, and essentially at this point, autonomy for the South, and really therefore, by extension, for the entirety of the Judean and Israelite community in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of called Eretz Canaan, historically writ large, has essentially been forsaken, has essentially been handed off uh, to in this case the Babylonians again, who have now risen to become the new superpower and essentially ascended in place of the Assyrians. So Yechaniah at this point is essentially already been exiled, and Yechezkel is the first prominent prophet whose essential prophecy is being delivered outside of Israel. Very famously, this is the context in which she is delivering Nevuah. Chazal pick up on this. They ask how it's possible. They explain that God first spoke to him in Israel, because that's the only place, according to this rabbinic understanding, in which a prophecy is able to initially receive prophetic powers from God, but then he continues outside of Israel. But however we understand it, clearly Chazal are attuned to this, and the Psukim really, they're picking up on what's clear in the Psukim, which is that the Psukim make a very big deal of the fact that he is prophesying not in the land of Israel, initially, at least in the description that we find in the book of Yechezkel, but rather outside of the land of Israel, in Bavel, together with the people in exile. So at first glance, Yechezkel takes on a really very tragic and sad kind of overtone to it, because essentially what's happening here is that we have for the first time the exilic prophet. We have someone, it's not Yirmiyahu, is not tragic in quite that acute a way. Yechezkel is not undergoing the experience of suffering and torture at the hands of the people in the same way as Yirmiyahu, who is nearly murdered by his own townspeople, his own townsfolk, and all the other horrific, shameful uh, experiences and degradations that Yirmiyahu Hanavi has to undergo. And yet Yechezkel, though, in a way embodies the people in the sense that he is experiencing and prophesying from exile himself. Now, with that, we come to Yechezkel, and we will pause for a moment. Riva, go ahead.
I have a quick question. So is he, I just, this, kind of broad outline that you suggested, did Yechezkel stay in Jerusalem until the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, or was he exiled with the first wealthier
Yeah, he's
bunch?
going out with the first. Then that's why he is indeed prophesying from Babylonia,
Okay,
even though as I say, he's prophesying some 11 years before the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash. That's
got
exactly
it.
it.
So if he's prophesying from Babylonian, there's still like this, sounds like there's a core bunch of people still there. Who's he prophesying to?
So again, the more prominent members of the community, is an excellent question. The more prominent members of the community have already been exiled. The ones who
Right.
are left for Nebuchadnezzar and the Nebuzaradan to destroy in 586 BCE are really the middle class to the lower class Jews. They were I wouldn't say they're the nobodies, but they're definitely not as prominent.
But his prophecies and his admonitions don't reach those people
They do
unless they
not direct. That's correct.
right,
He is mostly actually prophesying about the doom of the temple from afar. I think that's an important point. But
right,
I think his part of the point is though that he wants to emphasize to the people two things. Number one, that they must rectify their sins. He's not
mhm,
saying or else. He's saying this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to
right,
befall our people because right you have done X, Y, and Z. But then, as we'll see in a moment, the second piece of his prophecy is actually much more uplifting, is consolation in nature. We often think of
okay,
Yeshayahu as being the classic sefer that's divided in two, but actually Yechezkel in its own way is divided into these two elements, as we'll see. In fact, with that, I think it's a good segue to then,
mhm,
with that context, to describe the book of Yechezkel as a whole. So, as I say, Yechezkel, it's also a very difficult book. It's also not a short book. Thus, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel are each essentially their own independent works. But Yechezkel Hanavi, his work is divided into two sections that are equal lengths, at least in terms of the number of prakim. Total of 48 chapters in the book of Yechezkel. The first 24 are harsh rebuke. The last 24 are essentially consolation. Now, the of those 24 chapters at the end, the last 9 chapters from Perek Mem through from Perek Mem to Perek Mem Chet are actually a faint description of some rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. Let's assume that it's by its Shlishi. There's fascinating literature about this, not only in Chazal, not only among the Rishonim, the classical commentators, but even among non-Jewish scholars as well. So, for example, I think it was Isaac Newton who was among his writings actually after he died was found a commentary on the dimensions of the structure of the temple, the third temple as described in the book of Ezekiel, and there's a whole mathematical and scientific analysis that he engages in as only one in the early modern period, someone who is at the cusp of the transition to new scientific enlightenment, where we find this kind of blend of religious Christian biblical commitment and scientific expertise in a fascinating way, kind of welded together in his work. So it's far from only the Jewish scholars who engage in this work, but that's just a fascinating piece of the book. That said, our focus is on the first component. So let's just do a little bit of a deeper dive to set the stage. So first Yechezkel in the first, let's say, 3 chapters roughly. I'll divide it into a couple of sections. The first 24 chapters, just to again offer an overview to set the stage for the particular prophecy that appears at the very beginning of the Sefer, and I think we can better understand Ma'aseh Merkavah, the symbolism of the Se'ara, with not only the larger historical context, but the context in the placements in the book of Yechezkel in particular as well. So at the very beginning, as often happens, we have the call to prophecy. First three prakim, Yechezkel first sees this dramatic vision of the Maaseh Merkavah, the divine chariot. That's in chapter 1. That seems to be a symbolism of God's presence in exile. We'll come back to that. He's appointed a watchman for the Jewish people, and he performs the first of his, I would say, very physical acts of representation of his prophecies. This is something that exemplifies Yechezkel throughout or through much of his Sefer. The first physical act that he's told to perform that represents his Nevuah is he's told to eat a scroll containing messages of lamentations. As it were, you are what you eat. That perhaps goes back to Yechezkel himself, and he internalizes this sense of mourning, of the destruction that is to come. Chapters 4 and 5 in his book, they represent this theme of siege and the destruction of Yerushalayim, which is imminent. Yechezkel performs a series of symbolic acts. He lies on his side. He eats rations for someone who's suffering under a famine. He's told by God to shave his head. And these acts foretell Yerushalayim's siege, its famine, the dispersion, what's described in Parshat Nitzavim, v'nidachta, that there will be dispersion of the Jewish people to the four corners of the earth, right? So that's essentially the theme that we find here. In the subsequent two chapters, Prakim Vav and Zayin, we find condemnation for the Jewish people's idolatry. In particular, many of the themes coming back to Sefer Devarim, many of the themes that God talks about that the Canaanites used to perform in their worship of God are now adopted, unfortunately, by Yehuda, or have been adopted or described as having been adopted by the Judeans. So, for example, in Devarim, it describes al heharim haramim ve'al hagvaod v'tachat kol yitzra anan, that the Canaanites had been worshiping their gods on all of these high places. I should add as well that it was Baal that we saw last time with regard to Eliyahu, who was, of course, dealing with the northern kingdom, but that was a temptation for the south as well, though perhaps to a lesser degree, but certainly it was present for the Judeans as well. Yechezkel essentially describes that as a result of this, there'll be complete destruction of Malchut Yehuda, pestilence, war, exile. And in that way, a refrain that appears in many places throughout the book of Yechezkel, V'yadu ki ani Hashem, V'yadu ki ani Hashem, V'yadu ki ani Hashem, that the Jewish people will come to know that I am God in much the same way that Moshe described that the Egyptians will come to know that I am God. So what we have here in a way is kind of like an inversion almost. You're taking themes that had applied to non-Jews, to other people who are not necessarily consistent in their values with the Jewish people, those being thrust and essentially placed upon the Jewish people as well. So that's Prakim Vav and Zayin of Yechezkel. Then we find, beginning in Perek Chet, we find a very interesting scene, which we'll come back to in a few minutes, which is as follows. In Perek Chet of Yechezkel, we see a fascinating phenomenon. You recall that we said that Yechezkel was prophesying from the Golah, from the exile in Babylonia. We'll see that he's prophesying from a river called Nehar Kevar. What's fascinating here is that whether literally or metaphorically, symbolically, he is whisked away to the Beit HaMikdash again. So we don't know if he's actually been in the Beit HaMikdash, but he certainly was from Judea. He was exiled together with the other prominent Jews, but now he is returned. He observes, traumatically perhaps, idolatry being performed in the Beit HaMikdash proper. It seems this is literal. It's hard to know for sure. It may be metaphorical, but in effect, he sees that the Jewish people are worshiping idolatry in the Beit HaMikdash itself. This prompts divine judgment. Angels punish all the wicked doers. And as a result of this, the divine presence departs Yerushalayim, which signifies, of course, the abandonment of not only the Beit HaMikdash, not only of Yerushalayim, but of the Judean kingdom as a whole. Now, note already the connections that we can already begin to infer and to detect between the themes of the initial prophecy of Yechezkel, of the divine presence being seen in Bavel. And what he sees here later on in his book, but whether or not it's sequential chronologically, hard to tell, but we can see the logical, perhaps, progression that's taking place. He is now observing the divine presence leaving the Beit HaMikdash. He started off by seeing it in Bavel, and now he sees why it needed to go to Bavel, because it was actually departing the Beit HaMikdash as a result of the idolatry that the Jews were performing in none other than the temple itself. There are a series of other prophecies. I'll mention them very briefly. It's just worth having a good overview for that alone. I think it's worth very briefly going through. It's not often that we get a chance to study it, not only Yechezkel in any depth, but at least to get even as much as an overview of this relatively obscure sefer. So I think it is certainly worthwhile. Chapters 12 through 14 of Yechezkel. Yechezkel is actually asked to act out a prophecy yet again. He's returned to Israel, to the Golah, rather, to Babylonia. He acts out actually Tzidkiyahu's exile, so he's kind of like walking barefoot outside. God denounces remember, Tzidkiyahu was the last king of Yehuda, so he was the one who was placed instead of Yechanyahu, but essentially a pure vassal king. He ultimately has his eyes gouged out while his children are murdered, but he is treated otherwise respectfully, right? Quote unquote respectfully, right? In Bavel, once you've learned who the boss is, we don't necessarily need to kill you because we don't want to, right? We've already won. So no, there's certainly a certain the Babylonians had a certain they were not like the Persians in the sense that they did not allow every nation under its empire, every faith under its empire to worship its own god. They still understood the value of not turning an enemy population unnecessarily against them once they had already been destroyed. And thus it was tactical on their part and quite effective to allow the Jews in Babylonia, once physically exiled or at least subdued, to allow them to continue to practice their faith as long as it was clear that this would not cause any rebellion against the authorities. So that's what we find in chapters 12 through 14. Again, Yechezkel acting out Tzidkiyahu's exile. God also denounces the false prophets. And he even says, very interesting aside, he says that even the most righteous individuals at that time, or righteous individuals in history, their merit cannot save a sinful people. As it's just interesting as an aside, 3 names are mentioned. One is Noach. Doesn't mean that there was Noach living at this time, but it means these people, their righteousness could not save the Jewish people or any people. And then we have Daniel. And the third is actually Iyyov, which is very interesting and touches on what we'll discuss next week, is God's appearance to Job from the whirlwind, as well, as if these are 3 legendary great spiritual personalities, and even in their great merit, no one can be saved. Now, interestingly enough, of these 3, the simplest understanding is that only Daniel is Jewish, which is intriguing as well. Maybe we'll touch on that next week. But Noach, before there was such a thing as a Jew in the world, Daniel, if it's the same Daniel, right? It's also possible that there's a series of well-known stories, of legends about these kinds of great spiritual personalities that are kind of percolating, and that actually that's where the story of Iyyov is drawn from. Many say that the story of Iyyov is, of course, a metaphor, that it was never meant to be taken literally, and it may actually be drawing on a series of legends about these famous personalities that kind of circulated among Middle Eastern people at that time, and that the book of Iyyov is actually taken from that story, whether or not there was such a historical person. So there's some interesting discussion about the relationship between this pasuk in Yechezkel and the larger story of Iyyov, but it's hard to discern one way or the other for sure. Okay, chapters 15 through 17, so a number of allegories, not necessarily acting anything out, but in chapter 15 of Yechezkel, so the Jewish people, meaning the Judeans, are compared to a useless vine, good for just a fire. So we're not beautiful, we don't adorn in any way, but we are good for conflagrations. So if you want Nebuzaradan to lead the Babylonian army in and to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, so we've got that down. We're just perfect firewood, timber just waiting to be if not cut down, to at least be to be destroyed in fire. In chapter 16, Yerushalayim is compared to an unfaithful wife who betrays God. Chapter 17, a parable of two eagles that represent the Judeans' political treachery. Although there is a reference, an allusion here to the beginning of Nehemiah, the beginning is of consolation to a messianic restoration. In the continuation, we find more going through chapter 24, a series of lamentations for fallen kings of the Judeans, a review of the Jews' rebellious history. This is actually where we draw from in the Haggadah. We talk about Va'omar lach b'damayech chayi, that God saw us, a newborn, abandoned infant, saved us, and ultimately came to our salvation. He alone was responsible for raising us despite our rebelliousness, and yet we spurned him despite all of his eternal kindnesses and all these kinds of things. And then finally, toward the end of these sections, we find a series of additional metaphors. One is the unsheathed sword. This is chapters 21 and 22. God's sword of judgment is ready. Jerusalem is full of bloodshed, of corruption, of injustice. No one is righteous, he declares. Leaders and people are condemned to devastation. Chapter 23 also appears, is played off of in a classic kina, lamentation that's recited on Tisha B'Av in particular. This is the metaphor of Aholah and Aholiva. Aholah means literally her tent. Aholiva literally means she is in my tent. Or Oholiva, sorry, my tent is in her. Her tent over there, and my tent is in her. What do these refer to? Well, it's an extended allegory of these two sisters who commit adultery. In the metaphor, literal adultery, of course, in the parable, right, or in the nimshal, as we would say, they perform, of course, spiritual adultery through idolatry, through alliances with an over-reliance on other kings, on Egypt in particular. And Aholah represents her tent. That's the northern kingdom, because that's where they built fake Beit HaMikdash, a fake temple, celebrated pseudo holidays and the like. And Aholiva, my tent is in her. That's a reference to the Beit HaMikdash, to Yerushalayim, to Malchut Yehuda, where my genuine temple, my genuine presence was manifest, but yet has been driven out. Finally, chapter 24 in Yechezkel, the Sir Nafuach, a boiling pot, personal tragedy. It's a parable of essentially of a pot that's boiling over, which represents the impurity of Yerushalayim. Yechezkel's wife, literally or symbolically, dies that day, but he's told not to mourn, which symbolizes the community's or the nation's stunned reaction to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. He suddenly becomes a widower. He suddenly loses his wife in much the same way that the Jewish people experience shock. They should not have experienced shock. They've been warned about this for decades, and yet they've been rebellious. Yet part of their shortcoming is that they were arrogant. They were overly reliant on their own righteousness. They were overly reliant on the protective, almost amulet-like, mystical-like powers of the Beit HaMikdash, not recognizing that sacrifices that the prophets warned again and again and again, right? That if the Jewish people are corrupt and are also worshiping idolatry, if they're cheating on their wife, as it were, on their husband, as it were, on the side, if they are engaging in murder, in criminality, not taking care of the poor and the needy, and so on and so forth, that ultimately it will all fall apart. Okay. So with that in mind, we can begin to understand and to analyze the symbolism of this se'ara, which is paired with the presence and departure of the divine in the beginning of the book of Yechezkel. If you take a look at the source sheet now, with all of this context, it makes a lot more sense against that backdrop. So if you take a look, we begin, and again, just chose a couple of select psukim just to illustrate the transition of the visions of the divine chariots and the divine presence toward the beginning sections of the book of Yechezkel. So, for example, Parak Aleph, Pasuk Dalet, right at the beginning, he says, and I saw, there's a stormy wind coming from the north, which seems to echo the northern enemy that Yirmiyahu actually warns about in his opening prophecy. According to many, that's a reference to Babylonia. Babylonia, if you think about a map, is modern day Iraq, is actually east of Israel, but the ancient travel routes, many historians have pointed out, actually ran up and around. So if you wanted to know where the Babylonians would attack from, was actually from the north. So as Yirmiyahu describes Mitzafon, Tipatach, Hara'ah, the destruction will come from the north. It's not the only interpretation of that pasuk, but I do think it's the most persuasive, and that may well be what this pasuk means as well. So the stormy wind comes from the north. Anan gadol, the ish mitlakafat v'nilgalo saviv, a great cloud with fire flashing up. Umitocha ke'in hachashmal mitoch ha'esh. And out of its midst, like the color of electrum, hard to translate literally precisely, out of the midst of the fire. You see the word chashmal there, which is, of course, the modern Hebrew word for electricity. People didn't know originally what electricity was. And so finding the word chashmal here from an extremely obscure source, this almost miraculous kind of energetic power that we don't know how to define and how to capture, it's not physical, and so on and so forth. Actually, this works as quite the appropriate metaphor, if you will, for electricity. Okay, so Yechezkel, and then he sees this. I didn't give you the whole thing here because I don't understand it. I'm not going to pretend to understand it. But then you can open up Yechezkel and you can either understand it better than I do or not understand it along with me. But then he has the entire vision from Bavel, as I say, from the Har Kvar, of the Ma'aseh Merkavah. So descriptions of the angels, of the parts of their body that look like certain animals, the parts of their bodies that look like certain humans. They look like cherubs, all these kinds of, again, obscure descriptions. But one of the most important things is that it's on Merkavah. It's on some sort of chariot that is moving through this world, or through the air, through the stormy winds in this Merkavah. So what we immediately see is a couple of things. Yechezkel, again, is in Babylonia. He sees the divine presence. It's engaged in a process of moving. I don't know if it's arriving now or it's just moving in exile, but there's a theme of movement. There's a theme of transition, and there's also a theme that, stunningly, as opposed to Yeshayahu, who had his vision of God while in the land of Israel, Yechezkel not only receives a prophecy outside of Israel, which is enough, and so it's described and set forward immediately at the beginning of the book, but more than that, it is a vision of God, as it were, the closest thing that we can get to a vision of God outside of Israel. So that's how we open this book. And so it's very curious, it's very interesting, because we said at the outset that Yechezkel is divided into two parts. And the way that we just described the first 24 chapters, quite frankly, it's devastating. And think about all of what we described. Unsheathed swords and people worshiping idolatry, and the divine presence leaving Yerushalayim, and the two widowed wives, and the two wives who've become widows, and all of the tragedies, all of the destruction that Yechezkel not only describes, but even acts out himself, not mourning over the loss, if only symbolically perhaps, of his own wife. All of these tragedies, all of these traumas, and yet at the very beginning, the psukim set the stage actually with a se'ara, symbolizing the mystery of the divine presence in exile, no less. So that's already very significant, and it's moving, which suggests that it may have left, but it can still settle in another part of the Jewish community. And that, I think, is going to be critical for understanding what Yechezkel is perhaps suggesting through all of his prophecies. If we continue in Perek Gimel, so I said the first chapter and then the second and third are in a way paired, in the sense that the second and third kind of take this theme of, they're talking about destruction now, but take this theme of divine presence and weave it together with the themes of destruction for the Jewish people's sins and that of exile and dispersion. So after he has this, his first set of prophecies, Yechezkel describes Va'akum. So I got up. Vo'etzei el ha'bika. I went out to the plain. V'nei sham kavod Hashem omed. And there the glory of the Lord was standing, asher kechavod asher ra'iti al nahar kavar, like the glory that I had seen by nahar kavar, vo'epol al panai. So once again, even after we see the destruction of the Jewish people prophesied and declared from exile, bracketing this opening prophecy is his ability to nonetheless see the vision of God in exile. Now, as I say, after a few more prophecies in chapters 8 through 11, those are the ones where Yechezkel is whisked away to the temple, literally, metaphorically, seeing people who are worshiping idolatry in the Beit HaMikdash. And the psukim explicitly link these two prophecies to one another. Source 3, Perek Pasuk Daled, V'hinei sham kavod Elokei Yisrael. Behold, there the glory of the God of Israel was present. Kamar asher ra'iti babika, just like the vision that I had seen in the plain. So explicitly linking these two, suggesting that the Kvod Hashem that he initially saw in exile at the beginning of his prophecy of punishment and at the end of the prophecy of punishment, that is the very same divine presence, the glory of God, that he now sees in the place where you would expect to see it. Now that he's, again, whether literally or not, in Yerushalayim, seeing, overlooking, as it were, the Beit HaMikdash. And indeed, next pasuk that we've listed, Chvod Elokei Yisrael, Na'ala mi'al hakrov. He's looking down to the Kodesh HaKadosh now. Asher haya alav el miftan habayit. What's going on? The glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub, had ascended from the kruvim. Kruvim, let's assume, of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, upon which it had been, to the threshold of the house. What's happening here? Again, very obscure prophecies, but we have some sense. What seems to be happening? The glory of God is ascending. Why is it ascending? You would expect God to be descending. What's happening here? What seems to be happening is that because of the Jewish people's sins, God has finally said, I'm not only warning about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, I'm not only warning that my divine presence will ultimately leave Jerusalem. It's not a guarantee. Now it is actually leaving. Even before the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, as Chazal says, the Gemara says, by the time that the Romans in the Second Temple came to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, it was mere itzim ve'avanim. It was just mere sticks and stones. That's all it was. The same motif that we find here. By the time the Babylonians will come to actually destroy the Beit HaMikdash, the Jewish people, as it were, have already destroyed its spiritual essence by essentially causing the divine presence, by forcing it out through their idolatry. If the Jewish people are going to replace their priests with priests of idolatry, to worship God in that way, in such a despicable, adulterous way, in the Beit HaMikdash itself, they have given the divine presence, as it were, no choice but to ascend. And so the story of Yechezkel begins to become clear. He starts in exile, he sees perhaps the arrival, the movement of the divine presence, offering perhaps a sense of assurance that God's presence will be felt even in exile, and that is necessary. The reason that it is necessary is because the divine presence is no longer in Jerusalem, it has ascended. And indeed, if we continue, source 5, Perek Yud, Pasuk Daled, Vayaren Kvod Hashem Me'al HaKruv Al Miftan Habayit. Then the next stage, the glory of the Lord rose up from the cherub to the threshold of the house. It's going up. And again, in source 6, Perek Yud, Again, psukim chet and tet, just skipping a few psukim. Vayitzei kvod Hashem me'al niftan habayit vayamod al hakruvim. The glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the house, stood above the cherubs. Vayisu hakruvim et kanfehem. This may be different kruvim than the kruvim of the Beit Hamikdash, but it's not crucial for our purposes. They lift their wings. They rose up from the earth in my sight while I saw them. The glory of the God of Israel was above them. Slowly but surely, the divine presence ascends from the Kodesh HaKodashim, from the Beit HaMikdash, until in source 7, Vayal Kvod Hashem Me'al Toch Ha'ir. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city. Stood on the mountain which is east of the city. Any guesses? What mountain is east of the city of Yerushalayim? At least the old city of Yerushalayim, the oldest city. What we call the old city is actually a much larger section than Yerushalayim encompassed at that time, in a slightly different section, but the Harabite is, of course, the same. But does anyone know what's east? If you think about East Jerusalem, if you go east is beyond the Temple Mount.
Is it Har Tzion?
It is indeed Har Tzion and Har Hazitim as well.
Right.
That's an extension of the same.
Right. I'm just visualizing. Right.
Yeah, 100%. So essentially, I would say Har Hazitim is even more precise here for this purpose. So this is Har Hazitim. Har Hazitim, of course, at that time was not necessarily a cemetery in the same way that it is today, although there's certainly a lot of archaeological evidence that in that area there were people who were buried as much as 2,500 years ago, from the period of David HaMelech, so first temple period, which is stunning. There are caves where we are relatively confident that people were actually buried at that time that are visible from Har Hazitim. I had the good fortune to actually visit Har Hazitim a few years ago. I think it was just 2 summers ago. I went on a tour. Little did I know that about 2 to 3 months after I visited, it would no longer be recommended to go without neshek, even with neshek. I don't recommend trying that tour these days, unfortunately. But it was a tremendous equipment. And you can literally, you see the wall behind you. It's absolutely extraordinary. You can't see very much of anything that's going on in the old city proper, but you get a sense as to how close it is. I mean, really, it is absolutely unbelievable. And Mikedem La'ir, it's very interesting. It's no coincidence that according to Christian tradition, this is the place where Jesus ascended to heaven. You have all these you have monasteries and you have nunneries there, and churches there that mark all these different locations. Many of them have been property of Christian, different parts of the Christian church or community for hundreds and even thousands of years. It's really a remarkable scenario, and the reason is that this is really an essential extension of the Beit HaMikdash, and this had a very significant role. So, for example, according to one Mishnah, this is one of the places that the people who were holding torches would stand to indicate, to then communicate to the next mountaintop, that Rosh Chodesh had arrived. According to many, there was a place right there, we think we know where it is, although we don't know for certain, where all the ashes of the Beit HaMikdash were actually burnt. According to this, also anything that needed, by the way, that includes the para aduma, the red heifer, was, according to historians, are not absolutely certain, but we think it's very likely that we know exactly where, or more or less where they were, the merit to be there, all these kinds of things. All this is a long way of saying something I think is very striking, which is that the Shekhinah is settling where? It's not ascending all the way to heaven. Where does it go? It goes Har Hazitim. No longer the Beit HaMikdash, but not too far away either. Now you may be wondering, wait a second, how can it both be in Babylonia and also settle on Har Hazitim? How are these compatible? Right, but of course the answer is one of many, many, many possibilities. Number one, right, it could be that these are at different times. Remember, these are temporarily discrepant. But of course, this is the divine glory. God doesn't have to choose one place or the other, as it were, right? That this is something that God can manage if he so chooses to have his presence concentrated in multiple places. So whether you take one explanation or the other, there's a very, very powerful set of messages here. Yechezkel on its surface is describing a traumatic destruction that is not only being prophesied or foreseen, but is literally spiritually happening even before the temple is being destroyed. And yet, at the same time, nestled in the story of Yechezkel, what we see during those very same prophecies in which he describes the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash and the destruction of the community in Judea, at the very same time, the reassurance that God's presence is not too far. It's mikedem la'ir. It's just around the corner, right? And as well, it's off in Bavel as well. So this is, I think, a very telling and very significant uh, kind of symbol of the fact that God is leaving the Jewish people, but he, in a way, he's leaving not too far, and he's also, in a way, leaving together with them. I should hasten to add as well that there is, it's interesting that in the stories in Sefer Shmuel of the flight of David HaMelech from Yerushalayim when Avshalom foments his rebellion, interestingly enough, we find the description of David fleeing Ir David, and he goes to the very tip top of Har HaZeitim. Okay, so-called because of these ancient olive trees. And by the way, you still see those olive groves there now. Of course, that's one of the major places where they used to get the olives from the menorah. But the point at which David reaches that point of no return is when he is just at the top of the mountain. For King David himself, the point at which he's going too far, he's truly exiled from his own monarchy, is when he goes beyond Har HaZeitim. And perhaps that is a kind of a foreshadowing, an illusion of the notion that God is not even going as far away as David HaMelech. And if David himself was able to restore his own throne and to restore his own kingdom, to return to Jerusalem with joy, that God willing, God will be able to as well.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So later on, there's this envisioning of what might be described as the like third Beit HaMikdash mirachefet, like hovering over.
Mhm.
Is that located geographically? In other words, was that hovering over Har Zeitim as well? Does the
We don't
text?
find any description of it hovering. We
I'm
just
just
find that
curious. Yeah.
it's actually being built. Now,
Bill. Okay.
yeah, or yeah, I would describe, and not being built, not the process of being built, but it seems to be, it's just describing its parameters
Mm-hmm.
and the service that's going to be performed there when the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. But surely, I mean, and there's a question: is it literally a physical one? Is it, you know, some sort of spiritual Beit HaMikdash in the heavens that, you know, then will descend? That's sort of the, kind of all these debates about how the third Beit HaMikdash may or may not, you know, come to be, as if we know literally what will happen. Of course, we don't. But many of those come from there. But no, it's not a coincidence at all that this is kind of the bracketing of the book of Yechezkel. It's very much the same story. It starts with the departure of the Shekhinah from the Beit HaMikdash, and it concludes with its restoration, as if to say it's not just about the physical story, but again, it's about the spiritual departure of the divine presence from the temple. So 100%. If you take a look at the end of the sheet, you'll now appreciate why the rabbis do what they do. What I mean by that is that in commenting on the story of the Galut Bavel generally, and the book of Yechezkel in particular, the rabbis developed the theme, a major theological theme which teaches that even as the Jewish people go into exile, God is present with them. This is not a rabbinic idea. This is a biblical idea. This is the implicit thrust of, I would suggest, the book of Yechezkel as a whole, and the image of the se'ara, of the moving, dynamic presence of God, not only in Jerusalem, but just outside Jerusalem on one level, and all the way over in Bavel on the other, or on the second level. Take a look at source 8, Bereshit Rabbah. The Midrash teaches, Am Rabbi Yacha Galula Edom Shechina Imahem. The Jews were exiled to Edom. The Shekhinah was present with them. That's the current exile. Galu Bavel, and during the first exile, and there's the first destruction of Beit HaMikdash, during that exile as well, Shekhinah Imahem, the Shekhinah was with them. Not only that, there's a later pasuk I did not cite here because it's quoted here in the Gemara in Megillah, Chavtet Amud Aleph 29a, Umikdash Me'at, that when we describe a mikdash, a shul, a synagogue, as being a mikdash me'at, ilu batei chnisiyot ubatei midrashot shebebavel, those are the shuls and the study halls in Babylonia. Shekin Omer, as it says in the pasuk in Yechezkel, vo'ehilu lahem lemikdash me'at, and I would say double capital I, right? In other words, right, I, the full manifestation of the divine presence, will be as their miniature mikdash, because we've already seen that that is exactly where the mikdash, the spiritual essence of the mikdash, has traveled, ba'aratzot asher ba'u sham, to the places where the Jewish people will travel. And surely it's no coincidence, just to skip to 11 and 12 for a moment, that we see as well, Chazal pick up on the Masaot, the encampments of the Shekhinah, which should not go too far. Eser, the Yalkut Shimoni, Eser Masaot Nasa Shekhinah, 10 stages the Shekhinah travel, Mikaporet, La Kruvim, Lechomat Ha'ir, that should say, Le Hazetim, the ark covered to the cherubs, to the wall, right, of the temple, of the city, to the Mount of Olives, and so on and so forth. Again, that it's 10 masaot, but it's to a limited degree to, again, give a sense of consolation and hope to the Jewish people, even in the midst of this destruction, of this dire prophecy. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, Tzadi Hey Amud Aleph 95a, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Shlosha Allah Hakadosh Baruch Hu Imahem. There are three whom the Blessed One, he went with them into exile. Echad Mehem Golei Bavel. One of them was, of course, the exiles of Babylon. And with this motif, I think we can now appreciate, let's circle back to source 10, Midrash and Shmot Rabbah, which teaches that, I think, not only when the Jewish people go into exile was God with them, but on the flip side as well. And this, I think, is the very end of Yechezkel, but again, it's, I think, implicit in the beginning of the book as well, that that when they were redeemed, ultimately the Shekhinah returned once again to its place. So I think, in short, the theme of Se'ara, the theme of the dynamic whirlwinds, really encapsulates the complexity and the spiritual tumult which the Jewish people experience, but at the same time, not only is it spiritually tumultuous, like in the story of Eliyahu, but similar to the story of Eliyahu, it also represents a sort of a settling down, kind of the departure of a kind of like as we said last time, a tempestuous moment or tempestuous relationship. In the story of Eliyahu, it is replaced, or he is substituted for, or if you will, completed by his disciple Elisha. And in our story, of course, there is no other figure or personality that enters, but the divine presence itself, that, as it were, makes up for or provides that consolation for the Jewish people by remaining with them and allowing for a sense of greater equanimity for the Jewish people, even as they endure the traumas of the exile. Next week, for the last class, we'll take a look at the third and final revelation, that, as we mentioned, that of Iyyov. And this is the only one of the three where, as opposed to some sort of departure, which is clear in the case of Eliyahu, and is, I think, now clearer in the sense of the story of Yechezkel, it departs at least one place and settles in one or multiple other places. Here we're going to see the opposite, the revelation where it's truly God coming down, and we will see that this is some sort of attempt, but a very obscure and difficult and mysterious attempt to somehow resolve the vexing problems that have been torturing Iyyov, not just physically, but psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually as well, throughout the course of the book. So we'll examine that, God willing, next week for the final opportunity to learn together, at least over the course of our time in this particular course. Happy to stand for any last questions. Thank you so much.
I have a quick question about the Se'ara.
Yeah, please.
And when does the Se'ara ever kind of settle, like this this spiritual trauma that does it, and when? Because when the story ends, they're still in Galut, so there's still a level of spiritual chaos
A
going on,
hundred,
I would assume. So
yeah.
yeah.
No, 100%. I think that's really important. The I think that the flip side to our point of emphasis in the book of Yechezkel is that though there will be ultimately a restoration, right? That number one, that se'ara will be settled down when the third temple is built.
Mhm.
But at the same time, I think it's also a reminder to the Jewish people that they shouldn't confuse their relative comfort in exile with the full settling down of the Se'ara, exactly as you
Mhm.
say. So I think in a way, the Jewish experience in Bavel was almost too successful, if you will. Not that it actually was. Of course, we don't want us to be suffering, God forbid. But at the same time, it was important for there to be a reminder that this should be a harbinger of positive things to come, but it's not. We're not actually there yet. So I think that's when it will ultimately settle down, and that I think is the symbolism. It doesn't come full circle until God is indeed restored to the divine presence or to the place of the divine presence in Yerushalayim itself.
Got it. So it's much more. I mean, when I take the kind of the long view, this is like this. There are varying levels of this kind of like spiritual trauma. You can't live in a state of trauma for centuries and centuries and centuries, but it's never fully resolved until there's a third Beit HaMikdash, if I'm understanding what you say.
I think that that's right, and I think that that's
Yeah.
kind of the larger narrative arc of the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other? Okay, that's good. Reva, I saw your note. Yeah, there will be. I know you'll have to miss next week, but there
I
will be
have
a
to miss next
recording,
week.
so you can email the office and get
Thank
that.
you. I'm sorry. Okay,
No,
that'll
no,
be
no,
great.
it's okay. Thank you so much for joining today, and thank you so much, Rabbi Sinesky, for this class. Very interesting, and I'm looking forward to next week. Just a reminder that we have more Sefer Azman classes this week. This week we have Torah for All, Jewish Universalism in Early Rabbinic Thought with Miriam Zami that will start on Thursday night at 8 p.m. Eastern. And yes, we'll see each other next week. Thank you so much. Lehitraot.
Literal, thank you.